Who exactly take on the discussion roles of protagonist and antagonist in the collaborative context of argumentative discourse? By extending the speech act perspective to the level of interaction, it can be shown in which ways positions and argumentation in support of positions are developed. Externalization is achieved by identifying the specific commitments that are created by the speech acts performed in the context of argumentative interaction. Rather than being treated as internal states of mind, in a speech act perspective, notions such as disagreement and acceptance can be defined in terms of discursive activities with well-defined ensuing commitments. Acceptance, for instance, can be externalized as giving a preferred response to an arguable act that commits the respondent to not attacking the act anymore. Finally, dialectification is achieved by regimenting the exchange of speech acts aimed at resolving a difference of opinion in an ideal model of a critical discussion. Now let me go on talking about the fallacies, because it's a striking fact that scholars of argumentation are often drawn to studying argumentation by an interest in particular practices of argumentative discourse and improving their quality where this is called for. To be able to satisfy this interest, they have to combine an empirical orientation with a critical orientation towards argumentative discourse. This challenging combination can only be achieved if they not only examine argumentative discourse as a specimen of actual verbal communication and interaction, but also measure its quality against normative standards of reasonableness. If pragmatics is taken to be the study of communicative and interactive language use, as is customary among discourse analysts, then the need for uniting the empirical descriptive angle of research and the critical normative angle can be acknowledged by construing the study of argumentation as a branch of what I call normative pragmatics. In normative pragmatics, argumentation scholars make it their business to clarify how the gap between the normative dimension and the descriptive dimension of argumentation can be systematically bridged, so that critical and empirical insights can be integrated. The complex problems that are at stake in this endeavor can only be solved with the help of a comprehensive research program, consisting of various interrelated components. On the one hand, there is a philosophical component in the program in which a philosophy of reasonableness must be developed, and a theoretical component in which, starting from this philosophy of reasonableness, a model for acceptable argumentation is to be designed. On the other hand, there is an empirical component in which argumentative reality as it is encountered in argumentative discourse must be investigated, qualitatively as well as quantitatively. Then, based on the results of these philosophical, theoretical and empirical endeavors, in the analytical component, the normative and the descriptive dimensions must be systematically linked. Finally, in the practical component, the problems must be identified that occur in particular argumentative practices, and methods must be developed to solve these problems. As it happens, the conceptions of reasonableness argumentation theorists have developed in the philosophical component of their research program diverge from the outset, so that in the theoretical component, different outlooks emerge of what is considered to be an acceptable argument. When developing our approach to argumentation, my late colleague Rob Grotendorst and I were strongly influenced by Barth and Krabbe's formal dialectics. Just like them, we started from a conception of reasonableness that replaces so-called justificationism with a critical testing procedure. By implementing this critical rationalist philosophy in the theoretical component of the research program, we pursued the development of a model of critical discussion that gives substance to the idea of resolving difference of opinion on the merits by means of dialectically regulated critical exchanges in which the acceptability of the standpoints at issue is put to the test. The outcome of the discussion between the protagonist and the antagonist depends on the critical questions asked by the antagonist and the adequacy of the protagonist's responses to these critical questions. The systematic interaction that takes place between the speech acts performed by the protagonist to defend the standpoint and those performed by the antagonist to respond critically is characteristic of the pragmadialectical resolution procedure that we have designed, which combines a dialectical view of argumentative reasonableness with a pragmatic view of the verbal moves made in argumentative discourse. The model of a critical discussion we develop provides an overview of all argumentative moves that are pertinent to a development of each of the discussion stages that furthers the process of resolving a difference of opinion on the merits. Analytically, in a critical discussion, 4 stages can be distinguished that have to be completed in a constructive way to be able to resolve the difference of opinion on the merits. First, there is the confrontation stage. You cannot resolve a difference if there is no difference, so there needs to be a difference of opinion. And you have to externalize that from the potential disagreement space. Next, there is the opening stage. You cannot resolve a difference of opinion if you have nothing to go on, so you have to look for joint procedural and material starting points. You have to determine, as it were, your zone of agreement as far as these starting points are concerned. Then you cannot resolve it if you don't do anything anymore. So you need an argumentation stage in which both parties try to establish whether, given the point of departure acknowledged by the parties, the protagonist's standpoint is tenable in light of the antagonist's critical responses. And finally, in the concluding stage, the result of the critical discussion is established. The pragmadialectical model of a critical discussion I've just briefly sketched is a theoretically motivated system for resolution-oriented discourse. In a critical discussion, the parties attempt to reach agreement about the acceptability of the standpoints at issue by finding out whether or not these standpoints are defensible against doubt or criticism. To be able to achieve this purpose, the dialectical procedure for conducting a critical discussion cannot deal only with inference relations between premises and conclusions, but should cover all speech acts that play a part in examining the acceptability of standpoints. In pragmadialectics, the concept of critical discussion is therefore given shape in a model that specifies all the types of speech acts instrumental in any of the stages the resolution process has to pass. Because in actual argumentative discourse, speech acts are often performed implicitly or indirectly, in practice a great variety of speech acts may fulfill a constructive role in the resolution process. Now, the acid test, I told you that I was going to talk about the fallacies. The acid test for any normative theory of argumentation is to what extent this theory enables us to deal with the fallacies. In the study of argumentation, the fallacies have been an important object of study from antiquity onwards and have remained a popular subject of study ever since. In 1970, Charles Hamlin caused a revolution in the study of argumentation and in the study of fallacies through his monograph Fallacies. He noted that the logical standard treatment he had detected in the leading logical textbooks of the time started from a logical standard definition of the fallacies. And the logical standard definition is that a fallacy is an argument that seems valid but is in fact not valid. And then Hamlin discovered that there was a certain kind of incongruity between the treatment of the fallacies in these logical textbooks and the definition, because he said many of the fallacies that are indicated are not arguments at all. And some of them are arguments, but they are certainly not invalid. Take, for instance, begging the question or circular reasoning. That is not invalid. There's something wrong with it from our perspective, communicative perspective, but it's not invalid. and in certain cases it's certainly true that something is going wrong, but the reason of the fallaciousness is something entirely different than invalidity. That goes, for instance, for the argumentum ad verecundiam, the abuse of authority. Now, in my view, the theorizing about fallacies has to start from a general